You wanted to listen to hip hop on the radio, it was after midnight in New York, and it might be Chuck Chill Out, or it might be Marley Marl, it might be Red Alert. And what did we do? We got our 90-minute Maxell tape, popped it into the recorder, and we recorded the Red Alert show. When we went back to school, the house party, we were listening to that Red Alert tape. When hip hop gets out to the West Coast, when folks like O'Shea Jackson and Andre Young start to get moved by this movement, they didn't hear it on a radio. It was mixtapes literally circulating around the country. It was a form of social media. And if you want to think about the power of hip hop in this moment, this track here from Rakim Allah. Rakim was taking. Rakim was taking. Had to stand in darkness and I was torn. So I'm gonna pause it here. Y'all have any idea what Rakim's talking about? No. And that was the point. The genius of mid-1980s hip-hop is that the language was coded. It wasn't accessible. In the case of Rakim Allah, who is a member of the 5% Nation, many of his lyrics were steeped in the lyricism of the Nation of Gods and Earths. Only folks who had access to that linguistic system would have any idea what he was talking about. But there are other examples of rappers using very distinct regional dialects and regional vernacular. And this was important for hip hop in that period of time because it allowed hip hop to be public and political at the same time. What we've seen in terms of the shift in hip hop, for instance, in thinking about social media, is that hip hop is now overly accessible. That was the price that hip hop paid in order to get its paper right. So it's not going to be the ideal vehicle to politicize young folks because the message is too accessible. When Chuck D and Public Enemy recorded It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, and you listen to a track like Rebel Without a Pause in 1987, and he references Chesimard, don't nobody know who Joanne Chesimard is? Right? Except for very few specific folks who knew the history of Joanne Chesimard, later Assata Shakur. That's how it functioned at that period of time, right? So it became a different kind of form of social media that allowed for black folks, because what social media is about, black folks being able to communicate en masse with each other in social settings. Which brings us to this one. Chaotic to legendary KO. Moments after Katrina. What is happening in 2005? We have Hurricane Katrina, but there's something that's also happened technologically in this period of time. 2004, 2005 witnesses the emergence of YouTube. YouTube as a social media platform is unimaginable 5 years prior, in part because there's no such thing yet available in masses to the public called broadband. For those of you who remember the dial-up internet, God forbid one of your friends thought they were cute and wanted to show you some video, and they emailed it to you, and the file is too large, right? And it's, you're trying to squeeze all this data and information through a dial-up phone line, and stuff just gets blocked, right? Their email that you're still waiting for 15 years later on your dial-up system, right? And it would put you in a bind because this one file would block, and you got 100 emails after that you can't get until this one file finally shows up. Broadband created a way to present massive amount of data, right? And what that meant is that it could also do things in terms of presenting visual data, sonic data. No more of those little 30-second bad videos that were sent that would take you literally 2 hours to download. But YouTube also represents something else. It gave the individual citizen the power to intervene into conversation. So one of the first moments really around Black organizing and Black activist efforts is this piece by Chaotix. Oh, don't do that to me. So I'm gonna have to tell you this story. So Chaotix, of course, is a rapper from Houston. He took Kanye West's Gold Digger and flipped it as a song that critiqued the Bush administration's inability to deliver goods and services to Black folks in New Orleans. And of course, it raised all kinds of questions because with YouTube came the crisis of intellectual property, the crisis of copyright infringement. Because all the images and sounds that Chaotix uses in this video is not stuff that he was given permission to use, including the Kanye West song. But it became this brilliant intervention, right? And the actual original version of the video has long disappeared from YouTube for all those reasons. But this is the thing, because this moment is pure hip hop. Chaotix got the song from Kanye West. Where Kanye West get the song from? Well, he paid Ray Charles' estate more than $1 million for the permission to use I Got a Woman. They also get like 100% of the profits from the sale of that particular single. And you might ask why Kanye would do that. Well, Kanye would do that because Kanye knew that that song would transition him from hot rapper to pop star. Right? Which of course immediately puts him in the line of fire where he very clumsily says George Bush doesn't care about Black people. But this is the other piece about that song. And this is why it's important to think about what Black social media practices are, because it is a culture, as Henry Louis Gates talks about in his great book, The Signifying Monkey, of sharing and borrowing, referencing, citation. The brilliance of Blackness is the way that we can do citation and folks not know where the citations are coming from. Which is why you can get mad at Beyonce for her appropriation when someone had to tell you that she was appropriating it. Which means that she knows the archive better than you do. And that's important to remember. Beyonce knows her way around the archive. We get mad because we don't. That being said, where did Ray Charles get the song from? Specifically, 2 church songs. One song that drew from the lyrics, I got Jesus becomes I got a woman. Right? The melody drawn from another gospel song. So he's drawn from 2 very different gospel songs to create a sound, and it's hard for you to imagine this in 2016, that was profane. The brilliance of Ray Charles is that he knew the folks who were up in the club on Saturday night were sitting in the pews on Sunday morning. So why don't you just make a song that reaches everybody? Why are you messing around with it? This is a secular song. This is a church. Ray's like, nah. Just, they know where this is coming from. But this is a culture that has consistently borrowed and shared and layered multiple meanings. So that, for instance, where again, you think about the work of Gates, and he talks about this figure of Esau Elegbara that we know in the United States as the signifying monkey. Oscar Brown Jr.'s recording from 1960, right? This idea that there is this figure in Black culture that is responsible for us receiving information. And some folks get some information, some folks don't. So when Branford Marsalis does his jazz album in 1992, the title of the album is I Heard You Twice the First Time. And of course, we use social media in that same context. So we get somebody like Barack. This is from the spring of 2008. I know a lot of you have seen this clip before.
Yeah, that's why she's only airing negative attacks on TV in Pennsylvania.
Talking about Hillary.
Like most places. Look, I understand that because that's the textbook Washington game. That's how our politics has been taught to be played. That's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her back in the 1990s. So I understand it, and when you're running for the presidency, then you've got to expect it. And, you know, you've just got to kind of let it. That's what you got to do. That's what you got to do.
So I love this moment, right? Because this is where I get to query the audience. How many folks have no idea what he's referencing? I'm sure some of you don't want to tell me. You don't know what he's referencing, right? So here he can give a citation of not just a Jay-Z song, but Jay-Z and hip hop writ large, with a simple little gesture. Now we understand it was political games, right? He was trying to get elected. He wouldn't make that same gesture in 2012. We get that. The ground had shifted a little bit. But in 2008, the fact that he knew his way around the archive, right, and knew how to do citation was something that, you know, for young folks, it's like, we could trust this dude. Might. Kathy Cohen, University of Chicago, has this concept of participatory politics. Henry Jenkins, who really is the OG in talking about things like social media in the academy, talks about participatory culture. My friend and colleague at UT Austin, S. Craig Watkins, talks about the young and the digital. Collectively, what their work suggests is that when we think about this moment, the way that young folks are using social media and using various archives, that they're engaged in acts that are interactive, shareable, or per Jenkins, spreadable. Jenkins has this thing, like he doesn't like that phrase virus, something going viral, because it makes it sound like it's a sickness. And he often talks about spreadability and thinking about like the way that you would spread peanut butter, right? Spreading information in the kind of way that it sticks, right? Has a little bit of substance to it. They talk about acts that are peer-based. They talk about acts, and you all understand this, that are not guided by deference to elites or formal institutions. Reverend Charlton. They talk about acts that are meant to address issues of public concern to young folks. They talk about acts that are not solely defined by forms of social media and digital technology. This is critical, because very often the critique of young activists who engage in social media is that they are social media activists. Very often these are folks that were already engaged in grassroots organizing that simply adapt to a new technological landscape in order to do the work that they were already doing. 6, this idea of social media allowing youth to access and mobilize large networks to amplify issues of concern to them, a digital counterpublic. So when Trayvon gets killed, one of the networks that gets accessed and engaged is this Harry Potter group of like 300,000 people. Because the head of the group felt something about what happened to Trayvon Martin, he was able to activate 300,000 people, a large number of which look like nobody in this room. So that when we talk about those hoodie marches in 2012 and everybody doing those hoodie selfies, it was about all these other kinds of networks being accessed. So when Watkins talks about what broadband did was expand a relatively small collection of early adopting technophiles into a massive but highly differentiated public, and I love the range of people that he talks about. Netizens, world builders, bloggers, gamers, social networkers, and content creators. Because one of the things that we miss about gamers is that they know their way around the technology. And once they get politically engaged, that skill set that they use in gaming translates into their social justice activity. 2013, there is a mass-mediated celebration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Philip Agnew, Sophia Campos, each were promised 2 minutes. Like if they told me I had 2 minutes, I don't know what I would do with that. I'm a college professor. I don't know how to say good morning in 2 minutes. And of course, the Attorney General went too long, and some other prominent white person that wouldn't have spoken in 1963 went too long. And so Campos and Agnew's time were cut. But this is a new generation. Agnew went back. Mr. Cameraman, let's go find a spot. Right? And I'm going to record my 2 minutes.
My name is Philip Agnew, Executive Director of the Dream Defenders. And this morning, my time, as well as that of Sophia Campos, leader of United We Dream, was cut.
You want to have a revolutionary moment in this country? Put broadband in the hood, right? Because what folks are mainly doing in terms of navigating social media and the internet is on their phones. They're filling out job applications on their phones. What seems to be the primary purpose of a public library these days? For folks without access to broadband to get a half an hour in front of a terminal to do whatever. So, with that in mind, how do we think about movement in that context? So, S. Craig Watkins talks about how social and mobile media platforms have emerged as the dominant technology in young people's lives. They have not known the world without computers or software capable of handling multiple tasks at the same time. From their view of the world, the computer has always been what one research group calls a multitasking hub. And then Gardner and Davis, from their book, The App Generation, they've come to think of the world as an ensemble of apps, or perhaps, in many cases, a single, extended, cradle-to-grave app. If no app can be imagined or devised, then the desire simply does not matter. When we see the moment of Mike Brown's death, top left we have students at Howard University. On the right we have members of the St. Louis Rams, who incidentally are moving from St. Louis. The bottom we have the cast of Ava DuVernay's Selma, referencing both Mike Brown and Eric Garner. This moment that we recognize now as hashtag politics. And of course there's I don't like to talk about generations of black folks, I like to talk about genres of black folks. There's some other genres of black folks that have been critical of what they see as simplistic hashtag politics. But we know, immediately after Mike Brown is killed and we start to see media images of Mike Brown, the young folks said something was afoot. That the photos that were circulating of Mike Brown were tethered to official narratives of his criminality. And so they began this moment, if they gun me down, understanding that if they were in Mike Brown's shoes, media might use a certain kind of portrait of them that fit into this criminalized narrative as opposed to one that actually represented their actual humanity, right? And in some ways, it's a tragic moment because you realize that 18, 19, 23-year-old folks already understand the inability of mainstream media to recognize their humanity. But this is the thing. When I talked to Tanzina Vega of the New York Times the next day, because the New York Times was writing a story about how young folks use these hashtags, you realize that this hashtag was actually a critique of mainstream corporate media, and suddenly mainstream corporate media had to write stories about how they don't recognize the humanity of young black folks. This is an important moment, right? We're not just telling you you got it wrong, we're forcing you to report the fact that you got it wrong. So that when we think about this paradigm shift, it is Black Lives Matter that fits perfectly within this context. The only times in the last 2 years I've seen CNN and MSNBC report stories in which they had to admit that the original source of the story was TMZ. Building community, right? That's what hashtags are about. This is how you build networks. Forced media coverage and accountability. The lesson I learned about Twitter before I was on Twitter, Tina Marie. Tina Marie dies in the spring of 2011. Right? Some of you are like, who? Right? Most white folks are like, who? Tina Marie being the white woman who sounded like a 40-year-old black woman, who Motown was so confused about her identity that when they released her first album, her picture doesn't show up on the cover because they thought folks would be confused by why this white woman sounds so black, whatever that means. She dies, and black folks are giving out a wellspring of outpouring by how important she was, and mainstream media is going, who? Right, because this is a white woman singer who never crossed over to white people, always staying firmly in the pocket. So, forcing media coverage, mobilization, cross-racial social justice, and of course the question that we're raising at this point in time is whether or not this leads to policy change. All of us trying to find out one little space to be able to contribute to this work. I know I ain't walking in the streets of nowhere. I'm 50 years old. Right? I understand that this is a young people's movement. Right? And part of our responsibility is to create conditions in which young folks can do the kind of work they can, help them organize, help them generate access to resources, what have you. So my little small contribution to this moment, a little show that we do at a Duke called Left of Black, now in its 6th season. And I'm just going to end with this clip. It is the promo from our 3rd season. This will be 4 years ago.
What is Left of Black? Rhythm and creative spirit, black feminist film, education, politics, curating black intellectual tradition. Left of Black is Left of Black.
I feel like most people recognize
This black picks me stay ahead of this and black. My book bag we dip cause Rhapsody has got your back.
Y'all know who the rapper is in the background? That would be Rhapsody from Snow Hill, North Carolina. She's been doing our theme music for the last 4 years. She's headed to Los Angeles now for the Grammy Awards because she has a Grammy nomination because she was one of the contributors to Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. So thank you. Do I have time for questions or am I out? Oh, okay, we can do some questions. Thank you.
So this question is from my mother, who's a quilter, I was saying. And I was telling her I was coming to this, and she has less understanding than I do about Twitters, and I'm trying to learn it. She said, could you ask Professor, you, if quilting, and as you mentioned earlier about the songs, and she's been studying a lot about the history of quilting, and would you consider quilting a form of social media?
Yeah, absolutely.
And have you done any research?
I have not done any specific research around that. You know, the extent of my knowledge about quilting is Faith Ringo.
Okay, yes.
In terms of the work that she's done. But that's an important part because part of this work, even as we're trying to build forward, we're also trying to construct an archive, right? What is the archive of the ways that black folks historically have used various forms of social media? And quilting is firmly in the context of those traditions.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So if we defined, if we had to, social media, is it an array of arts? It doesn't just, so my mind immediately thinks of song or something technology-based, or so is it broader?
It's an array, I wouldn't just say arts, I would say it's an array of communication strategies that black folks have used, of which art was part of it, right? Okay. And in fact, the ability for it to be subversive, in some ways, is predicated on it being art. Because very often the people, because the difference between black folks consuming the art and other folks buying the art. Very often the art buyers can't decode the messages in the way that those of us who consume it did, right? So in some ways, as art, it worked better because it allowed for it to get a wider circulation. Right? So, you know, when you read Robin Kelly's work, particularly Race Rebels, and he talks about the significance of a song like Louis Jordan's Ain't Nobody Here But Us Chickens, right? The song is written by white writers, right? Louis Jordan is really the first black crossover artist of the post-World War II period. But the song itself, black folks couldn't get meanings in it, right? This idea, because the whole premise of the song is that there are a bunch of chickens in the hen house, right? And the farmer's trying to figure out where all the noise is coming from. And the chickens go, ain't nobody here but us chickens, right? Okay, for a moment, like chickens are talking, right? So when you see Chicken Run, the film, you know, 50 years later, is partially embedded in this song, the idea that the chickens, right? It's like, you know, the little guy running around, the farmer running around. How can they do this, right? Because the chickens in the hen house are not supposed to be able to organize, right? And resist, right? So that's why that song resonated as one example of this, you know, with black folks.
So when you were talking about like the almost like deceptive use of like certain elements of culture, like kind of almost like password protect our culture.
I like that.
It made me think of like
I might have to borrow that, by the way.
Go ahead. Just put me in like So it made me think of the entire history and stuff like that. Like with capoeira, for example, like when you look at martial art, how it's used to distract and hide music. Do you, or are there any patterns or strategy that you like seen in your research about how to, I guess, keep something for ourselves? There's really nothing that we can create that hasn't been appropriated and taken from us and lost. In some way, its original meaning.
I think what we have to get back is to thinking about the value of what we create. Not just culturally, but understanding that there has to be some sort of value to it that allows artists to be able to sustain themselves. You know, part of the reason why, for instance, that we see this kind of appropriation of black art, because at least at this moment, there aren't necessarily systems within institutions and structures within the black community to be able to help artists to sustain themselves. Like the Ghanaian rapper Blitz Ambassador has been visiting Duke the last couple of days, and he talked about the fact that as a Ghanaian rapper, right, who's drawing on all these references, he cannot sustain himself in the U.S. There's simply no market for it, right? He goes to Europe and what have you, that's how he makes a living. We had examples of those structures, right? One of the best examples for me is to think about the Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues, when you talk about those baseball teams, a good number of which were black-owned concessions, black managers, right? When Jackie Robinson crosses the color line and the talent is integrated into the major leagues, the black economic structures are not. Right? How many black managers are there in 2016? How many black owners are there in 2016? Right? Magic is the face of the Los Angeles Dodgers, but he got like 2%. Right? He has very little stake in it, but they needed him to be the face of it to say, look, we got a black owner. So I think we have to really be cognizant and vigilant about creating structures within our community to support the art so that folks can sustain themselves and then create black art also. Because I think you're right. Right? The art works best, right? How great would formation have been if it was produced for and only circulated in our spaces? Right? Because then it's an intra-community conversation about all the stuff that she's raising, right? Part of our discomfort with that conversation is that we got white eyeballs on, right? And those white eyeballs, you know, are the things that make folks like Beyonce and Jay-Z so liquid, right? So we understand that, you know, she can't be Beyonce without speaking to this particular audience. One more. Dr. Alexis Pauline Combs. Whose name I couldn't remember when I was trying to mention her name earlier.
I love it. So I wanted to say something about the quilting, and then I had a question also, or just something I would love to hear you talk about more. So in terms of quilting, I just wanted to say that in the recent history, relatively recent history of women of color using digital media intentionally, that metaphor of quilting has constantly been there, right? So when Fallon Wilson and Moya Bailey and I first started to think about how do we use the digital sphere, we called it cyber quilting, because we really did want to invoke that reference of what is a technology that, right, the people who do need to know what we mean, know what we mean, the people who don't need to know what we mean, don't need to know what we mean, but also that we're piecing together scraps of our history. There's something about warmth, there's something about intimate domestic space that has to do with the relationships that we wanted to use the digital space in a way that would nourish us in a particular way. And so going beyond publicity to this idea of quilting was something that was really resonant with us. So I love that your mom asked that question, because that was what we were like, what do we call this? And the quilt was really the first thing that we could think of. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, about examples that you've seen of how the dominant media, I love the way that you talked about what it means to have to force or be forcing the dominant media to have to, in order to not be excluded from the conversation or to be too behind to cover certain things. And I was thinking about when Fannie Lou Hamer was testifying at the Democratic National Convention, and Lyndon Johnson was like, "Oh, we're gonna play, like we're gonna block her out," right? The moment when Fannie Lou Hamer was testifying, and it was like, "This is the 27th anniversary of a commemorative stamp," or like some ridiculous announcement that he blocked the news for. And what it caused was for her speech to be played over and over and over again on the networks because it was excluded from that day's proceedings. So obviously it failed. But I'm thinking about contemporary versions of that, like the ways that you've noticed, because I know you're paying attention, and I'm paying attention more to Fannie Lou Hamer than to the contemporary moment, I feel like sometimes. But ways that you've noticed that the dominant media is, in its scramble to keep up, in its scramble to try to remain dominant, has failed, or what opportunities you see there.
And so I think there are really opportunities here, because what we realize about mainstream media is that they get stuff wrong. What they consider information that needs eyeballs is not the information that necessarily needs the eyeballs. And quite frankly, I am suspicious of when certain things pop up in news cycles. Like, the Bill Cosby thing for me is really complicated. Not that Bill Cosby should go to jail. I'm clear about that. But a story that has circulated pretty widely for 20 years suddenly bubbles up the way that it has the last 2 years. And if the culture, white culture, has built up Bill Cosby to be the moral center of Black America, and then Bill Cosby is shown to be who he is, what does that do for young activists making moral claims on Black death and anti-Black violence at this particular point in time? I don't think that's accidental, right? And we can be complex enough to go, Bill Cosby needs to go to jail, but also recognize how white supremacy is using that narrative. And none of it is helpful to actual Black people, right? None of it's helpful to, to obviously women in this Black women in this context. When Tef Poe, in his response to Macklemore, because Tef Poe recorded a response to Macklemore's white privilege too, when Tef Poe goes, "We all mad at Bill Cosby, but we love Obama," formed by mainstream media. He's been given a platform from mainstream media because when he's on television, people watch him. Period. Right? For NBC to continue to cover him the way that he did, they do, when until like last week he was still an employee, is fundamentally problematic, right? But who calls? The media is not going to call themselves out. In any spaces where we might see progressive media, right? I think about, some of the work that's been done with the Real News, Democracy Now! As a kind of corporatized version of that, right? The fact that Al Jazeera America, which did important reporting on Flint a year before it circulated, which did important reporting on the fact that basically Chicago has these spaces in the city where they disappear folks who get arrested. So the kid who gets shot in front of the Burger King, there were two choices for him. Either he gets shot dead in the street or he gets disappeared. Right? It's Al Jazeera that's doing that reporting, right? So what does it mean that suddenly we have these progressive forces who don't have the ability? What it means is that even with their mistakes and their failings and their gaps, we have to be very vigilant. right, in terms of telling the stories that need to be told, and over again, right? And we're doing this against the challenge of folks who would rather watch Real Housewives, right? Or the Toni Braxton biopic, which was good. I enjoyed it. It's Thursday night. I enjoy Scandal, right? You know, that's my little reprieve from everything that's going on, right? But we have increasingly generations of folks who are just drawn to the ratchet, right? And we have to find a way, right, to make sure that we continue to tell these stories over and over. Thank you very much.